just going to get right into it. So, AJ, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and then I'll kind of introduce our conversation today.
Sure. So I'm AJ. I'm a senior front-end engineer at Rainforest. I work really closely with the product team to implement stuff in our product and our UI. At Rainforest, we use Rainforest to test Rainforest, so we use our own dog food. So I guess I'm a power user of Rainforest, and I've spent a lot of time with kind of the pains of various UI testing and DOM-based testing, and so. Writing this blog post was kind of a culmination of, me pushing through all those pains and arriving at a product that makes my life much easier.
And I am Fred. I am the CEO and one of the founders of Rainforest. And yeah, I got really excited when AJ shared the draft of this blog post because he encapsulated and described in much clearer ways than I've ever been able to basically why we have taken the approach we've taken. And so just to kind of give you a bit of framing for this before we get right into the conversation of what are the pros and cons of DOM-based testing and why you should be thinking about UI testing. Our vision at Rainforest has always been, and in fact the reason that I started the company 8 long years ago, our vision has always been to make easy, effective automation. And we've always wanted to be able to have tests that are super easy for non-engineers to create, super easy for non-engineers to maintain, and fast and cheap enough for you to run them all the time. At the end of the day, great test coverage is about frequent test coverage, right? And useful results. And so it's taken us a long time to get to a place where we have a product that we feel really proud of. And as of a couple of months ago, we have a super compelling automation product that I know from looking at the participants here, many of you are using every day. And some of you have tried and some of you have yet to have tried. And so basically we're now at the point 8 years in where, we're not just about crowd testing anymore. Crowd testing was actually the idea. It was always supposed to be a means to an end. What I mean by that is not that we're planning to ever deprecate crowd testing. Human-based, fast turnaround functional testing is critically important to any software business. But it's that the vast majority of the volume of the testing that you should be doing as a company will likely not be human-based testing because of speed and because of cost. And so now we have this really compelling product in the market. Basically, we wanted to expose our thinking and our principles, and specifically why we actually believe, philosophically speaking, as well as technically, why we believe this is actually the right way to do QA and the right way to do testing. And so, like I said, AJ wrote a lot of these principles into the blog post that we're talking about. You should also read the blog post. And yeah, we'll spend most of today, discussing the ideas contained within the blog post in depth, and then just saving a bunch of time for questions. So with that said, let's just get right into it. So, AJ, first of all, let's just start with the initial framing in the blog post, which is what is end-to-end testing, and where does it fit into an overall testing architecture?
Yeah, sure. So perfect place to start. And again, I definitely go into a lot of these things in more detail in the blog post. But in order to, I guess, understand end-to-end testing, you need a little bit of perspective on your overall testing architecture, which can be broken down into 3 kind of macro layers. The first line of defense against bugs that we have is our unit tests. So this is essentially just testing small chunks of code with the arbitrary unit, whatever that to your engineers. Example of that is if we have some button component that we give it some kind of label, which probably says confirm or save or whatever, and a function, which is something that's going to happen when I click the button. So I write some code that is going to take my component and mount it inside of this kind of simulated browser, right? It might be a headless browser, which is a browser that basically doesn't have a user interface. And then I just want to run some basic tests against it. Does it have this label that I expect it to have? And then does something happen when I click this button? Which is nice. We now know the button works, but we immediately run into a bunch of pitfalls, One of which being, what is that thing that happens when the button's clicked, right? Maybe I expect it to do one thing, but I've actually passed it a function that like wipes my whole database or whatever, right? And then at the same time, we're writing code to test code. And we kind of run into an issue there because do we have a bug in our code that tests our code? Do we write code to test the code that tests the code? So we can be reasonably certain that our button works, but not in all scenarios, especially since we're running these tests in complete isolation. So the button has no sense of what kind of browser it's in. It doesn't know what page it's being rendered in. It doesn't really have any kind of outside information. And so I think it's useful to think of this like using an analogy, the way SpaceX tests their rockets. In a perfect scenario, we would be testing our rockets in space where they're actually working all the time, but that's not realistic or cost effective. So a unit test might be the equivalent of testing that a single switch works, that actually turns the light on and off. Our next layer of testing is our service or integration tests, which are basically like bigger unit tests. We're testing multiple things and how they work together. So we could see this as a superset of the unit tests. We might be testing that my backend API talks to a Salesforce API, and whatever I expect to happen is what's actually happening. And then the equivalent to this in our rockets is maybe when I flip the switch, it actually turns the engine on. So my switch has been tested separately, my engine has been tested separately, but I want to make sure that these two things work together. And then our third and kind of final layer is our UI testing, which is essentially our end-to-end testing. And that is testing that our entire system is working together. So that might look something like I click the button. After I click the button, my front end sends some request to an API, which talks to my database, and then it talks to some other service and does a bunch of stuff. And then it returns data to me and then updates the UI in the way that I expect. And this is end-to-end testing, right? I'm actually testing that it's gone from the user back into the abyss of the cloud that is all of my various services, and it's come back to me and done what I expect. And so the equivalent of this is actually testing the whole rocket, right? Maybe I don't have an actual human in the rocket, but I do have some kind of automation that's running it. So yeah, that's kind of end-to-end testing in a nutshell.
Gotcha. So we've got basically a testing pyramid. We've got unit tests, we've got service tests, and we've got UI tests. And end-to-end testing is essentially driving the entire application through the interface, seeing it all works, seeing the request goes all the way down and comes all the way back. And that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think each layer kind of acts as a superset of the layer before it, right? So we can test all of these things individually, which is great. But the more macro we get while we're testing, the closer we're getting to reality and actually testing our entire system.
Right. So, so then basically we're talking about end-to-end testing here, right? And so I guess to ask the first obvious question, like one of the kind of contentions we make in the blog post is that, well, and it's right there in the title, that we think that DOM testing is not true end-to-end testing. So, you know, we've got super popular tools like Selenium, like Cypress, and they're actually sold as end-to-end testing solutions. And, you know, before I ask you the important question here, I'm just going to launch this little poll we've got. Just curious for everybody, do you have DOM-based testing today? So like Selenium or Cypress or some other, you know, typically headless browser automation framework. I'm really interested to see what the breakdown of the attendees is today. But anyway, so in the meantime, you know, the super popular DOM-based testing like Selenium and Cypress, etc., they're sold as end-to-end testing solutions. So do you agree with that? Is DOM-based testing end-to-end testing?
I would say no. So they are very close. And I think before solutions like RFA, that's as close as we could get to end-to-end testing. And the reason I say that is that the end user is actually using your interface, right? And
I think this could be, sorry for cutting in, I think this could be a great place to pull up the visualization that you have in the blog post, actually.
Sure. Yeah, so if we look at end-to-end testing with a visual-based system, or in specific, when a user is actually using your application, the end-to-end interaction that's happening is the user interacting with your interface, clicking buttons, type stuff, whatever, and then the way that they're reading data is actually looking at the UI itself, right? We have this idea of the DOM, which is the document object model, which is essentially a digital representation of your web page. You can kind of think of it as a data structure. It's a branching tree of all of the stuff that's on your page. And it offers us an API to interact with the web page, right? So we can manipulate the page, we can do stuff on it, and then we can also look at it and make assumptions about what the UI is supposed to look like. And this is what the browser uses to actually render stuff on the page for you. But it's an important distinction that the DOM and the UI are not the same thing. The DOM is essentially this layer that lives underneath the UI and kind of tells the UI what to look like. So when we look at DOM-based automation, it's more accurately represented by kind of inserting it here. And this is what the testing agent is actually interacting with. So when we're doing DOM-based testing, we're actually completely circumventing the user interface. There's no real interaction with it. And we are making assumptions about the UI based on the state of the DOM, which in general is usually a pretty reliable way of doing it. But there's a ton of pitfalls that come with that, which is the fact that the DOM and the UI you interact with them differently, right? I don't look at the DOM. I can't actually see the DOM. No user is even aware that the DOM exists. But with visual-based testing, all of your interactions are going through the user interface, both the inputs and the outputs. So I would say that DOM-based testing is not actually true end-to-end testing because we're just completely skipping the user interface.
Interesting. Right. And so then that's where you come to the kind of like super famous automation fails that we all know well of, like, you know, the transparent button or the completely clickable sign up link that is in white text on a white page, etc. So, you know, outside of those kind of gotcha edge cases, though, I mean, even if DOM-based testing is not true end-to-end testing, isn't it still useful? Like, what are the other problems? What are the other challenges with DOM-based testing, do you think?
Sure. Yes. It's still useful. I mean, obviously, it's given us a lot of test coverage, but there's a lot of pitfalls with it. Obviously, like you said, there's a lot of kind of impossible interactions, and that comes from the way that we interact with the DOM. So, for example, we might ask the DOM to dispatch some click event on a button, even though that button is not actually visible on the page. And so we're getting a test that says, yes, I clicked the button, and yes, this thing happened, but it wasn't actually reflected in the UI, right? So we get like a false pass or a false screen. But then at the same time, just like when we talked about with unit tests, we're writing code to test code, right? And so we run into that same problem of what if there's a bug in my code? And since it requires code, that also means that we need engineers to write these things, right? Which, you know, in my opinion, I think engineers' time is much better spent building things opposed to spending time updating these test cases. And also, users are real humans. They're not automation scripts, right? So again, we get into these impossible scenarios of not only is the UI not necessarily reflecting what we think the DOM says it is, but our automation has ways to interact with the DOM that a human can't, right? Then there's a lot of other issues on top of that, like triaging results, for example. If I get a failed test, if I'm not an engineer, there's code on both sides. It's very hard to figure out what's going on. Is the test broken itself? Like, did I actually break something in my app? Or is the code for the actually running the test buggy? And then on top of that, we don't always have a lot of business context for what we're doing. So even if I am an engineer, I might look at this and say, oh, was this an intended side effect if I'm not the person that implemented this feature, right? So triaging results can be tricky, and then sometimes you're going to have to go look for someone in particular that knows if this thing is broken, is it okay to ship this? And then we also have just a lot of ways for things to break in unintended ways. So one of the big differences between UI testing and DOM-based testing is that one is testing the interface itself and the interactions in it, and the other is essentially testing our implementation, which is the DOM, right? So that's roughly analogous to like my HTML structure of the web page. So I'm no longer testing the application, I'm testing the implementation, which means that things can break if I decide to, rename something. Maybe I change the IDs on a bunch of my divs or something like that. In reality, my UI looks perfectly fine and nothing is broken, but we've tightly coupled our tests to our code itself instead of testing the application as a whole. So it's testing like a smaller slice of our tech stack instead of testing the whole thing in a way that a user is going to actually use it in reality.
Yeah, and one of my observations, one of the commonality patterns we've seen with customers, and frankly, we used to do this ourselves before we built Rainforest Automation. We were using kind of third-party automation, and one of the things that's quite challenging is, especially from an engineer's perspective, it can be very easy to turn your tests into essentially unit tests, which is you're basically, as you said, testing your implementation. For us it's React, but whatever front-end framework you're using, and then you start to realize, like, well, hold on a second, even if this button worked perfectly in this little isolated theoretical sandbox, like the actual ways that applications tend to fail, the actual bugs that the majority of our customers are finding are much more esoteric and much less happy path than the ways that we actually would think to test through unit testing. I also want to just double click on one of the comments you made there around kind of skilled engineers are required for this. I think that probably a bunch of, well, I know because I see in the names, but a bunch of the folks on the call and a bunch of people who are interested in this topic will be QA engineers, right? And so I think what they'll be thinking, and we've heard this a lot, is, well, hold on a second, I've built this whole engineering skill set, building tests and building, really smart suites of tests and hooking them into our DevOps workflow and all of the rest of it. So I guess what's the value proposition for them? Because at the end of the day, there's parts of the organization that are really good at this kind of skill set that is writing automated tests. And what's the vision of how we can improve their lives? Like, is this worse for them after we move away from DOM-based testing?
Sure, and I think you touched on this in the beginning, and that's the fact that we're going to need humans for this period, right? This is not something that's going to completely automate away humans, both on the testing side and on the test writer / engineering side. In my opinion, this is much more of a tool that can be leveraged by QA engineers to be much more efficient. It allows them to spend less time writing code, which is obviously very time consuming, and more time thinking about their overall testing strategy and where this fits into the overall business goals. So I think that QA engineers are definitely going to be needed still. The expertise is needed, but it's more of a different way to go about writing the tests. I think all of these DOM-based tests can be pretty much directly ported over to a visual-based testing system like this. So they still definitely have a place in the organization, but they could be much more efficient and have a bigger ROI on the time that they're spending writing all of these tests.
Yeah, completely. And if you scroll down a bit actually to the kind of product team, engineer flow, I think anyone who's seen this blog post will be super familiar with this, right? This is just the completely standard workflow for a team doing, by the way, the relatively advanced team that's doing DOM-based end-to-end testing, right? Like this kind of back and forth is not. This is not a symptom of people who are inexperienced. This is like really advanced teams still have this kind of back and forth, and it just means that you have always this bottleneck in front of production, and it also means that you tend to have frustration and inefficiency within the team because you just have these loops that have to happen before code can be shipped.
Yeah, and at Rainforest, each engineer is essentially responsible for the Rainforest test coverage of the things that they're shipping. which makes it really easy because I don't need a ton of expertise in writing a Selenium script or whatever solution that you're using. And I'm the one that has the most context about the thing that I'm shipping. So it allows us all to own the life cycle of the feature, if you will, from writing all of the code, writing the unit tests, and then writing the rainforest tests themselves. And it seems to be a much more efficient workflow, and there's less back and forth and iterations.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So let's talk about rainforest automation, right? And obviously, the idea here is not so much to just chill for rainforest automation, but we also want to talk about kind of like in the abstract UI testing versus DOM testing. Like, how does UI testing, and obviously specifically our implementation of it, which is called Rainforest Automation, how does UI testing solve or address the problems that we've talked through with which DOM-based testing has?
Sure. So I think first is the fact that we're testing in closer to reality, right? Instead of implementing something that's interacting with the DOM, we're interacting with the UI, and we're actually seeing the user interface in the same way that a user would. So no code is required for this. No engineers are explicitly required for this, even though they are very useful always. We have to stay useful. And the tests are brittle, but in ways that we actually care about, right? So we want tests to break and basically, prevent us from shipping some bugs when something in the UI changes, not necessarily when something on the implementation side changes. And then I think the biggest argument for it being closer to reality is the way that the automation actually interacts with your app, which is on the OS level. So DOM-based tests are siloed to only working inside of a web browser, right? Because the DOM is part of the web browser. With Rainforest Automation, you are actually controlling the mouse and keyboard on the operating system level, which means that not only are we interacting with the app that in the way that a real human would, but we can do things outside of the browser, right? So we can open or download various programs or other browsers. We can drag and drop files from the desktop. We can copy and paste values from some other program into our browser. We can access the CLI and type commands into that if we want to. Pretty much anything a human can do on a computer, RFA can do. So we're no longer limited to being stuck in the browser. And so you basically open up the door to infinite possibilities. At the same time, this allows us to do true black box testing, which is essentially when we're testing something, we're testing the functionality of the app without peering into its inner workings, right? And getting a biased view on how things are working. Instead, we're just giving it some input, which is click a button, and then we're looking at the output, which is, was the UI updated in the way that we expect it to be? By definition, DOM-based testing can't really do this, right? Because we're interacting with the DOM, which is directly looking at the implementation of the app itself. So basically all of these problems that we see with DOM-based testing are solved by Rainforest Automation by working at an operating system level.
So then I guess the question logically would be, so why is Selenium, why is Cypress, why are the other DOM-based solutions still so dominant? Like, why are so many, no pun intended, why are so many organizations still using them?
Sure. I think that's really effective. It's like a first mover advantage, right? Like it's an industry standard, and it's the best solution that we had until now. It was really the only way to fully automate your interactions with the browser. So there's a lot of people that know how it works. There's a lot of infrastructure support for this, right? There's various providers that will host VMs for you and manage the browsers and allow you to just hook straight into those. You also have the option of running all of these things locally, right? You can run a browser locally on your machine and then control it with an automation agent. So I think it's mostly a factor of better solutions not existing until now, and not really having a good way to look at a screen and like a user interface and figure out what's changed in it, other than kind of high level visual diffing solutions that are out there, which are much more focused on something on your screen changed, and here's a bunch of differences. Are these ones good or bad? You know, accept these, decline these other ones. So yeah, I think it's mostly just, it's an industry standard and it hasn't been fully replaced yet.
So I guess the obvious question here, and yeah, just a quick plug for everyone. We are getting to the end of our agenda here, so we'd love to take questions or feedback or your own perspective on the things that we've been talking about. Got some good questions already. But yeah, AJ, I guess the question is then, what does the future of application testing look like? And how should we be thinking about this? Everyone is attending this webinar and or watching this video because they're curious and invested in the future of quality and in the future of testing. So yeah, what does it look like? How do you think about that?
Sure. So I definitely see the future as visual-based testing. Hopefully, Rainforest Automation, right? In that, I think that there's a lot of improvements that we can make around kind of AI machine learning. So right now, the way that our automation works is essentially you giving it all of the information that it needs, right? I want you to click on this button and then it should look like this. The things that it doesn't necessarily take into account yet is the kind of wider context of your app and things that are more unique to your app. Something that we've been thinking about lately are loading states, for example, which are very unique from app to app. It would be really cool if the automation was smart enough to do something like, oh, I see that your app is in a loading state. I'm going to wait before I try and apply this action. To do that, it's right now it's a lot of humans feeding it context, which again, humans are very important in this. But there's a lot of things that we can do once we start to understand greater context like that. Especially because a lot of these apps, like when you're testing something, it's not in a production environment, right? It's in your testing environment, which in most cases, you're not going to allocate as many resources to it. It might be slower. So it may not be working exactly the way that your app works in production, but very, very close. So being able to handle things like loading states would be great. The other piece of it is like test case management, being able to say like, hey, you have all of these components or these screenshots that look the same across these tests. Let us reorganize this for you. Or we noticed that this thing you didn't explicitly test in this test changed over here and it doesn't quite look right. Like, do you want to prove this? Is this the right thing? So that's something that we get with our crowd-based testing now. They have the ability to leave comments and say like, this passed, but this thing is weird and you might want to go back and look at this. So in the long run, I think that we're moving in the direction of no code, no engineer testing, because it's much easier, much more scalable, and it allows everyone on your team to just work on these visual-based systems. Yeah.
And so then what role will humans play, I guess? Because surely we can't automate everything. Context remains important. So yeah, what will be the role of humans in AJ's dystopian test future?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most obvious one is the testing strategy itself, right? So the reason we have multiple layers on our testing architecture is actually, if we go back to one of these, our testing pyramid, we have, obviously as we move up the pyramid to UI tests, we have more integration. We're testing a wider range of things, but these tests are slower and they tend to be more expensive. Unit tests can be run, billions of unit tests for almost for free, right? It's very quick. You can run them locally. So in your testing strategy, obviously we're balancing costs and how, what we actually care about testing in our UI. And then at the same time, there's a lot of human intervention that needs to happen when these things break, right? We expect tests to break. We expect them to break at certain times when we're shipping features that change things in our UI. And we need to be able to tell our automation, yes, we expected this to break. The kind of AI part of it might come in, which we have some of this in Rainforest already, which says, hey, this screenshot changed a little bit. we think this is what you want. You can just click on this and we'll just update all of your stuff for you. I think we'll continue adding layers of kind of smart suggestions like that. But what we don't want to do is get into a world where everything is automated and it just makes a decision for you. I think there's always going to be a role that a human plays in determining what's correct and what's wrong. And the AI is going to continually surface suggestions for you and to make your life easier and make things more efficient.
Yeah, and maybe, you know, I think also something that's kind of been very interesting to see while we've been on the inside of this journey of, you know, building one of the first proper UI-based automation tools is how important solving the brittleness problem is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like when you actually look at one of our key internal metrics that we look at, which is you know, the pass rate across the entire platform. When we started out and we were the first kind of pre-alpha customer, I think it was like 20 or 30% of tests were passing consistently in Rainforest Automation.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to today, we have it hitting basically the exact same average that the plain English tests, the tests run by human testers, are hitting. And so I think that, you know, this has been really, really exciting to see this evolution. And you know, the main challenge that we hear about from mature QA organizations is always basically signal versus noise, right? The like, how do I know when I get test failures that these are meaningful? How do I know that these are actually useful? How do I know that these are real and not just the test failing in some weird, awkward way, which isn't related to functionality? So yeah, I think the thing that I'm most excited about when it comes to thinking through machine learning is applied to automation is how do we start to take into account more and more signals so that tests become less and less brittle, so that when you actually get a failure, you know this is genuinely a problem that my customers are going to experience and not some failure of the system, right? As you put it, the code that tests the code.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes it so much easier to make those determinations with a visual-based system. You know, when you're looking at DOM-based tests, when they pass or fail, they're essentially unit tests, right? It's just going to say this failed because this, you know, this assertion was true and not false. And there's a lot of digging that you have to do to kind of figure out like what in the chain of events caused this thing to be true and not false. Whereas when you're looking at visual representation, 99% of the time, it's very obvious that like, oh yes, this is not right. It shouldn't look like this. So it makes triaging of results much easier and more intuitive. It requires much less knowledge of everything that's working under the hood. And, you know, in the same way that a user would, you know, use Facebook and be like, hey, this button doesn't work and report it. It's really easy to just recognize what's broken, opposed to like, oh, this changed from blue to green, but we know that we're shipping a feature that changes this from blue to green kind of thing.
It totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's a pretty nice overview of the blog post there, I think. We have some pretty good questions here, so let's just get right into it. Are any other testing solutions visual based?
I have seen some that are visual based, but not in the same way that our automation is. All of the visual based testing that I've seen is much more focused on visual diffing, which is a lot better suited to more static pages. So for example, I have a blog, I make a bunch of changes to it. Before it goes out, it's gonna highlight all of these things on my page that changed. And I'm gonna say, yes, this is okay. Basically approve all of these before it goes out. I have not seen any other visual-based solutions that are actually performing actions and looking at specific components and making assertions on those things. So yes, kind of, but in a very different manner, and they're kind of targeting a different manner of testing. I believe, so Percy.io, which I believe is now part of BrowserStack, which uses DOM-based automation. So you're running Selenium tests, and then it inserts this kind of visual diffing as a small, like additional layer of testing in there. So yes, similar, but different.
Yeah, it's super interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think in speaking to other founders in the space, everyone is trying to solve the problems that we have classified, at least within our philosophy, as being related to DOM testing. What it seems like is a lot of the players are trying to basically make smarter, more machine learning augmented DOM testing rather than going down the path of UI testing. I think that, one of the main reasons why is that, and this is like so often happens with startups, it kind of insider info here. In the early days of Rainforest, we actually tried to partner with both Source Labs and Browser Stack to use their infrastructure so that we could have our crowd run tests on various browsers, and both of them rejected our our advances. And so because of that, we had to build our own internal browser stack, right? Which are the virtual machines and the infrastructure that all of you who are customers will be very familiar with. And I think what's kind of interesting now, in retrospect, right, 6.5 years after we made that decision to build that, is that that's kind of what's allowed us to go down this path of building UI testing. Because unless you have control of the browser, and as you've mentioned a few times, the actual overall machine, not just the browser, unless you have control over the browser and not just a headless representation of the browser, it's really, really hard to even think about how to move beyond this paradigm of looking at the DOM, right? Or, interpreting the DOM. And it's very, very hard to move into this idea of actually like testing the UI itself. And so I think it's just one of those little funny kind of almost accidents of history where, frankly, we never thought that this was the direction we'd go right at the beginning of Rainforest. But because we made that investment, it's kind of enabled us to take a step back and solve this problem in a more comprehensive way.
Absolutely. Blessing in disguise. And, being able to work at an OS level lets us also do things like test apps that are just like desktop-based apps, right? And so it allows us to kind of step outside of the browser and take a more holistic approach of how people are actually doing these things, like how users are actually interacting with your app in an ecosystem that they're actually using it, instead of pretending that the browser is the whole universe, because it's not.
Absolutely. So great question here from a longtime customer of Rainforest who gives us fantastic feedback. Do we have a timeline for when we'll be able to do mobile testing using Rainforest Automation?
As far as I know, we don't have a timeline yet, because there's a whole set of extra problems that come with mobile testing, namely the way that a human interacts with it, right? So with current desktop automation, mouse and keyboard inputs, those are fairly easy to do with our setup. When we start talking about mobile, we're talking about recreating like a human hand almost, right? We have swipes and gestures and various things. That is a different and pretty intricate problem. So no timeline as far as I know, but it's definitely something that we're looking at. It is a very interesting problem to solve on the technical side of things.
Absolutely. Keep the questions coming in, folks, because we only have a few more questions and then we will wrap. So here's a great one. How does Rainforest Automation compare in terms of pricing?
Sure. So that is a nuanced question for sure. That ties directly into your overall testing strategy, right? Do I want to put more emphasis on unit tests and integration tests versus UI tests? Because as we saw with the pyramid, as we go up the pyramid, becomes a little slower, a little more expensive. In terms of DOM-based testing, so whether that's, I think if you're hosting all of your own infrastructure and doing DOM-based testing, you're paying less for that, right? But you have the overhead costs of engineers that are maintaining that wherever you're hosting all of these things. If you're using a cloud-based provider that is managing the VMs for you, the pricing structure is pretty similar. It's you're paying for access to some VM and you're paying for execution time essentially. What I have seen, I can't speak for all solutions out there, but a lot of them have kind of hard caps on how many tests that you can run in parallel. So it might be, you get this many VMs and you can run up to 24 tests in parallel. With Rainforest, we have a much it's much more scalable in terms of parallelization. So you could be running a lot more tests at once. So the price point is roughly about the same, but you're able to execute things at a much higher rate and with more confidence. Yeah, is there anything you want to add about pricing?
Well, just that relative to the crowd, it's 10x cheaper. And yeah, our intent is to keep is basically to keep driving the price down, right? Like we absolutely want testing over time to become a commodity from the perspective of your business, not in terms of the value it provides, but in terms of the cost and in terms of how much time and energy you have to put into it. And so, yeah, our goal here is to make it, basically as close to free as possible. Don't tell the VP Finance I said that, because as we all know, the lower the cost, right? Both in terms of like resources, engineering time, opportunity cost, also in terms of slowing down the release process, but also in terms of, the actual dollars that you spend for it. The lower the cost of testing, the more test coverage you can get. The more test coverage you can get, the more likely you will be to intercept the bugs. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at in terms of the philosophy of the pricing. And yeah, I think that watch this space, because we will keep driving the price down and we will keep augmenting the functionality of Rainforest Automation. Thank you very much, AJ. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Really, really appreciate you spending a bit of time with us. If you are watching this after the fact on recording, thank you. Please feel free to reach out to us with feedback and questions. And yeah, I'm just especially grateful to AJ for agreeing to host this and for spending a bunch of time talking through this blog post. For everyone that hasn't read the blog post, I strongly recommend it. It seems a bit dry, but AJ actually is a pretty good writer, so it covers the topic with some humor. And yeah, we'll be doing more of these in the future. We want to keep sharing how we're thinking about the philosophy behind why we build Rainforest. So thank you very much, folks. Thank you, AJ. Thank you to Sabrina. And we hope you have a good rest of the day. And see you later.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.